The Miracle of St. George by Theo Hughes. Mariam had the misfortune of being born a girl in Lalibela, Ethiopia. Her 4 older brothers went to a little school in the village, but as girls were more useful at home, where they could look after the younger children and cook injera, a grey, spongy, sour cake made from millet, school was not an option for her. Mariam envied the boys their freedom. After school they ran around the muddy streets of the village, talking to foreign tourists who had come to see the famous monolithic rock-hewn churches the area was renowned for. On most days they returned home with a few birr wheedled from them. In the few hours of the day that Mariam was freed from her chores, she also tried to get the smartly dressed foreigners to part with their birr. But all she could do was clap her hands and sing to them. Sometimes she would stretch up to touch them and they would smile, but they never reached into their pockets to put a birr into her hand. She wondered why the white Ferengis constantly waved the flies away from their faces. They swished angrily at the flies all the time. Mariam could hardly feel them as they crawled across her face, stopping briefly at the corner of her eyes where there was more moisture. She had learned to say hello in English, and sometimes followed the Ferengis saying hello, 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 until they reached the entrance of the first church, and she had to turn away and walk back down the hill, past the old blind woman with hopeful outstretched hands whispering Christus, Christus at each approaching footstep, and past the shriveled limbs of the villagers who had been crippled by polio or leprosy. They could never walk as high as the church, and had to be content to beg at the furthest point from the wealthy tourists. The young boys were the most eager and successful beggars. Their English was better because they learned it at school, and having no chores to fulfill at home, could spend time practicing it. They ran after the newly arrived cars, showing the drivers where the best hotels were, the best restaurants, and, of course, where to find the churches. Each time the Ferengis would take a wad of notes from their pocket, unroll it, and extract a birr for the boy. So many birr, thought Mariam. That's why white people wear those strange clothes with so many pockets. It's to hold their money. She had once counted 13 pockets on a man's pants and shirt. She imagined that each pocket had a similar roll of notes in it. The people in her village wore a galabaya, a white flowing robe. These had no pockets. Well, she decided, there was no money to roll up inside them anyway. Later in the day, it was Mariam's task to collect a bundle of firewood so that she could cook the evening meal of injera. All the able-bodied women of the village walked to the rural areas to gather sticks of firewood. The walk to fetch the wood was easy. It was downhill, and there was usually singing and talking, but coming home was a silent affair. Great, heavy bundles of wood had to be carried uphill. The women were bent double, and even girls as young as 5 years old were expected to carry a load back home. Mariam's mother was no longer able to carry the weight through years of malnourishment and ill health. As her brothers were not expected to help the women's work, her load was almost double what she normally carried. So laden and bent with the weight of wood on their backs were the women, that in the gathering dusk they looked like donkeys, their steps as slow and heavy as those beasts of burden as they walked up the rocky path back home. The best time of day for Mariam was late evening, after all the tasks of the day were done, and the single candle cast long shadows up the wall of the room she shared with her large family. The boys had returned with their few birrs by then, and the 2 younger girls lay curled against their mother's dark skin. She would listen to the exciting events of the day as they unfolded from her brother's lips. Sometimes they spoke of the strangeness of the Ferengis, how they smelt, how they dressed, how they were so pale and turned a bright red when they went to the market and walked in the sun for too long. At other times They told of the legends they had heard the guides tell the tourists visiting the churches. She listened spellbound to the legend of the birth of King Lalibela, how his mother, carrying the baby of the king of Axum in her belly, had fled to Roha, and how, after the baby had been born, the king had sent messengers to search far and wide throughout the kingdom for his child. They had found him and his mother surrounded by an angry swarm of bees. This was the sign, they said, that he would be a powerful king one day. They named the baby Lalibela, meaning the honey taster, and he did become their king. After ruling for many years, the legend continued, the king died and he went to heaven, where he saw many beautiful churches. After 3 days he returned to earth, and with the help of angels built the now famous churches right here in Lalibela. The best part of the story for Mariam was when the baby's father, the king, searched the whole kingdom for his child. She liked to pretend that her own father, whom she could not remember, was also a king, and that right now his messengers were searching for her high and low. The story about St. George was also one of her favorites. She loved hearing about how he slew the dragon and saved the Virgin from a fiery death. She would imagine she was the young girl waiting to be sacrificed to the dragon as St. George galloped up on his snorting white horse and thrust his sword through the dragon's throat. She imagined what it must be like to ride such a powerful horse and go and visit heaven like Lalibela had. And filled with all these images and events of people so far removed from her own life, she would fall asleep. In the morning the angels and kings and magic would be gone, and so were her brothers, and the wail of her baby sisters called her to a new day, which would be just the same as yesterday. Mariam's life might have gone on in much the same way, until she too became a mother and had a small Mariam to help her, but for 2 things that happened in rapid succession. The first was that Ethiopia suffered its worst drought in 30 years, and the crops failed, which meant that everyone had very little to eat. Secondly, the tourists, who had hated to see the suffering of the starving people, simply stopped coming to Lalibela. There were no cars for the boys to chase, and no one for them to practice their English on. People sat around all day patiently waiting. There was nothing to sell at the marketplace, and no flour to buy to cook injera. There was nothing to eat. The legs of the children became like sticks, and their bellies grew hard and distended. The boys stopped going to school, as they didn't have the energy to walk there. The village of Lalibela was dying.